She looked at the little girl in the chairs and said, out loud, in a voice that carried to every corner of that waiting room, "We don't have time for walk-ins like this. Take her to county." The child was 7 years old. She had been crying for 40 minutes. Her temperature was 103.4. And the nurse behind that desk did not even look up from computer screen when she said it. The man standing next to that little girl was wearing gray coveralls. His name was sewn above his breast pocket in blue thread. He was holding a paper bag of half-eaten crackers he had bought her from the vending machine to keep her calm. He was soft-spoken. He was patient. He said, "Please. She has had this fever for 2 days. I don't have a car. I walked here." The nurse looked at him then. She looked at his coveralls. She looked at the mop bucket parked beside the surface entrance 30 feet away. She looked back at her screen. "Sir, I've already told you. County is 6 blocks east. This facility is not equipped to handle uninsured walk-ins at this hour." The man was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having decided not to say all of it. He picked up his daughter. He carried her to a seat by the window. Nobody in that waiting room said a word. Nobody except a young nursing student named Priya Anand, who was on her 3rd week of a clinical rotation, and who had watched the whole thing from the corridor doorway. She was 24 years old. She had come into this work because her own grandmother had been turned away from a facility in Gujarat when Priya was 9, and she had never stopped seeing that look on her grandmother's face, the specific, dignified suffering of a person who has been made to feel like an inconvenience. She had carried it with her through 4 years of nursing school, through every exam and every simulation, through every conversation about equity and advocacy and patient rights. And now she was standing in a doorway. She would remember those 7 seconds for the rest of her career. What nobody in that room knew, not the nurse behind the desk, not the administrator who would arrive at 7 the next morning, not the security guard who had glanced over and looked away, was that the man in the gray coveralls had 11 years ago written a personal check for $4.7 million to fund the construction of the east wing of that very hospital, the wing that housed the emergency department, the wing whose name was engraved on a bronze plaque 60 feet from where his daughter sat burning with fever. His name was on the building, and they had asked him to leave. By the time the sun came up that morning, everything in that hospital was about to change. Rewind 12 years. Marcus Eugene Tillman was not a man who talked about money. He was a man who talked about work. He had grown up in the Crestwood neighborhood of Birmingham, Alabama, 3rd of 5 children, in a house where the heat went off in February and came back on in late March, and where his mother kept a jar of peanut butter on the highest shelf in the kitchen and rationed it like medicine, spreading it thin across white bread on Sunday nights when the week ahead looked long. His father worked the rail yards 5:30 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, smelling of iron and diesel when he came home, sitting down at the kitchen table with the same creak of the same chair every day, nodding at his children, one by one, like he was counting them, making sure they were all still there. His mother cleaned offices downtown 5 nights a week, from 8 in the evening until 2 in the morning, and went to church on Sunday morning still smelling faintly of industrial cleaner, in a pressed dress with a white collar and she held her head up the entire time. Marcus had watched her do that. He had watched her hold her head up in rooms where people looked through her. He had watched her hold it up when the bus was late, and her feet hurt, and she was exhausted in a way that had no name. He had watched her hold it up when a woman in a fur coat in the office building lobby looked at her rolling cart of supplies and said, without stopping, without even really looking, "Be sure you get under the baseboards this time." And his mother had said, "Yes, ma'am," and held her head up. And when the woman was gone, she had looked at Marcus, because he was 12 years old, and had come to help her that night, and she had said, in a voice as calm as Sunday morning, "The work is never beneath you, baby. The only thing that can make you small is how you treat people who you think can't fight back." He carried that with him everywhere he went after that. He carried it like a folded paper in his chest pocket, something he could reach for when he needed it. He was a quiet boy, serious. He read anything he could get his hands on. Library books, the backs of cereal boxes, a worn almanac a neighbor threw out, the financial section of a newspaper found on a city bus when he was 11 years old. He read that financial section 4 times on the ride home, and once more in bed that night with a flashlight. He was 12 the first time he read the words venture capital in a magazine he found in a waiting room. He had to look up every word separately. He wrote the definition in a spiral notebook with a broken spine and the number 7 on the cover, because it was the 7th notebook he had filled that year. He kept it under his mattress, beside 5 others just like it. He graduated high school with a 3.9 grade point average and a full academic scholarship to Morehouse College in Atlanta. He studied economics. He studied it the way some men study scripture. Not to pass a test, but because he believed it held answers to questions that had been following his family for generations. Questions about why the same amount of work produced such different amounts of security, depending on what neighborhood you started in. Questions about what compounded over time and what didn't. Questions about who built buildings and who cleaned them and what determined which side of that line a person fell on. He graduated Morehouse in 3.5 years. He spent 8 years after that working at a private equity firm in Atlanta. He was the only black analyst in his cohort. He wore the same 2 suits for the first 2 years because he was sending money home and because the suits were good quality. And he knew how to take care of things. He arrived earlier than anyone else and stayed later than anyone else. And he asked questions that made senior partners pause and look at him differently, the way people look at someone when they suddenly need to revise their first impression. By the time he left that firm, he was one of the top 3 performers in its history by return on investment. He left on his own terms with 2 partners he trusted. A woman named Diane, who had grown up in rural Mississippi, and an economist named Terrence, who had grown up 4 blocks from Marcus in Crestwood. And they started Tillman Capital Partners out of a rented office in Atlanta that had no windows, 2 desks, and a folding table they used for client meetings. Marcus was 31 years old. He brought his mother's recipe card for cornbread and taped it to the wall above his desk. Not because he cooked there, because he wanted to look at something she had touched. Over the next 14 years, Tillman Capital Partners built a portfolio that included commercial real estate, medical facilities infrastructure, 3 regional banks, and a construction management company that operated in 8 southeastern states. They made careful bets. They made patient bets. They did not rush. Diane had a saying she repeated at every partners meeting: fast money goes where it came from. They invested in communities that larger firms had written off, in hospitals in rural counties that needed new equipment, in neighborhood banks that needed capital to make small business loans that the big banks wouldn't touch. They were not doing this out of charity. They were doing it because they saw value where other people saw risk, and because they were right more often than they were wrong. By the time Marcus was 45 years old, his personal net worth was $62 million. He told almost no one that number. Not his neighbors. Not his pastor at First Baptist Crestwood, though he had paid for a new roof on the fellowship hall and a ramp for wheelchair, access, and 12 new pews in the balcony, and the pastor knew the money had to come from somewhere. Not the hospital board, when he wrote them that check for $4.7 million to fund the expansion of the East Wing. He asked only one thing in return. He asked that the wing be named for his mother, the Delamay Tillman Pavilion. Her name was on the wall. His name was on nothing. He liked it exactly that way. Camille came into his life at 37 and changed it in the way that only certain people can, not by rearranging anything externally, but by making the inside of everything quieter and more certain. She was a pediatric physical therapist. She believed in small improvements sustained over a long time. She laughed at things he said that no one else found funny. She made Grace, who arrived 4 years after they married, in a birth that took 16 hours, and left Marcus holding his daughter in a pale green hospital room at 2 in the morning, shaking slightly, understanding for the first time what it meant to love something that could be taken from you. Camille was diagnosed with ovarian cancer when Grace was 2. She died 18 months later. Marcus had held her hand for the last 9 days. He had not left the room. He had read to her from a book of poetry she liked, and played the music she asked for, and talked to her about ordinary things. The garden they had planned, what Grace would be like at 10, at 15, at 25. He wanted her last days to contain the future, even if she wouldn't be in it. After she was gone, he decided he wanted Grace to grow up near family, near his sisters and his brother, near the church where his mother was buried. He moved back to Birmingham. He bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood with a yard and a lemon tree that needed pruning and a kitchen that smelled right when you opened the windows in the morning. He kept a small office downtown where he still ran the firm. But his days in Birmingham, his real days, the ones he chose for himself, were quiet. He drove Grace to school. He made her breakfast and packed her lunch. He went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. He cooked dinner almost every night, working from his mother's recipe cards, things his mother had never had time to teach him while she was cleaning other people's floors. And 2 mornings a week, before the school run, he drove to Crestwood Community Hospital and volunteered with the facilities team. He had started volunteering there 18 months after the East Wing opened, when Grace was not quite 2, and he was still learning how to be alone in a house at night. He had called the hospital and asked if they needed volunteers in any non-clinical capacity. They had put him through to a man named Ron Devereaux, who managed facilities, and Ron had said they could always use an extra set of hands on the morning supply rotation, and Marcus had said he would come in the next Thursday. He came in the next Thursday. He wore the gray coveralls because Ron gave them to everyone on the team, and because Marcus saw no reason to make himself an exception. He mopped floors. He restocked supply carts. He fixed a stuck supply room door that had been sticking for 6 months. He listened when staff talked to him and was helpful when he could be and unobtrusive when he couldn't. He did this for 2 years. Ron Devereaux knew who he was within the first week because Ron had been in the facilities department when the East Wing was built and had stood in that parking lot for the ribbon cutting and remembered the name Tillman on the check that had made it all possible. He never said anything to the rest of the staff. Not because Marcus asked him not to, though he had, but because Ron understood, in the way that working people often understand, things that others theorize about, that a man has a right to show up somewhere and just be what he is without being explained. A handful of senior administrators knew. The board knew. But on the floors, in the corridors, in the waiting room, and the break room, and the supply closets, Marcus was the man in the gray coveralls. He was reliable and pleasant and easy to work around. Nobody looked past the coveralls to ask what else he might be, because the coveralls answered the question before anyone thought to ask it. He had been volunteering there for 2 years when Grace got sick. She came down with the fever on a Tuesday. It felt like a standard cold at first, a stuffy nose, a low-grade warmth, the kind of thing that resolves in 48 hours with rest and fluids. Marcus kept her home Wednesday and worked from the kitchen table while she dozed on the couch under a blanket, waking occasionally to ask for more of the ginger honey tea he kept making her. By Wednesday evening, her temperature was 101.8. He was not yet worried. He checked on her at midnight and at 3 in the morning. And both times she was sleeping, though her breathing was shallow and her cheeks were flushed in the way that children's cheeks get when the fever runs deep. Thursday morning at 6:30, she woke crying. Not the crying of bad dreams or morning discomfort, the crying of something that hurt. She pressed her left ear against his shoulder, and he felt the heat radiating from her before he even touched her forehead. He took her temperature, 103.4. He called his sister Janelle, who lived 12 minutes away, and who had 4 children of her own, and knew fevers way a sailor knows weather. Janelle said, "Get her seen today, Marcus. That's not a wait-and-see number." He thanked her and got Grace dressed. He did not have his car. His car was in the shop 2 miles away with a coolant leak that had been diagnosed the day before and was not yet repaired. He called a cab, but the estimated wait was 35 minutes, and he did not want to wait 35 minutes. Crestwood Community Hospital was 9 blocks away. He could walk 9 blocks. He bundled Grace in her coat and her yellow hat with the pom-pom on top that she called her thinking hat, and he carried her because she did not want to walk. And he walked the 9 blocks in 14 minutes, while she leaned his shoulder with her, eyes closed, and the paper bag of crackers he had grabbed from the counter swung from his fingers with each step. He was still in his Thursday volunteer coveralls. He had planned to go to the hospital that morning anyway. for his regular shift. He had not changed when Grace woke crying because he had not thought about what he was wearing. He had thought about his daughter. He walked in through the main entrance at 4:47 in the afternoon. The waiting room was full. Plastic chairs arranged in rows, the overhead lights that waiting rooms everywhere share, the particular low-level institutional hum of a place that processes people, a television mounted near the ceiling, a sign near the desk that listed triage categories in blue and green and red. He walked to the desk. The nurse behind the desk was named Renata Forsythe. She had worked at Crestwood for 9 years. She had good professional instincts in some areas and blind spots in others, the way almost everyone does, except that in her case, the blind spots lived in the same place where her first impressions lived. And her first impressions moved very fast. She looked at a man in gray coveralls holding a sick child and a paper bag, and she made a series of rapid assessments, none of which she would have been able to defend if asked to articulate them slowly, but all of which came out in the same direction. She saw what she expected to see. She said, "Can I help you?" He said, "My daughter has a fever of 103.4. She's had it since Tuesday. I'd like her to be seen." Renata Forsythe looked at him. She looked at the waiting room full of people. She looked at her screen. She said, "Are you registered with this facility? Do you have insurance documentation?" He said he was not registered, and that he did not have the insurance card on him, though he did have insurance, and that he could provide the information if she needed it. She said, "Without insurance documentation, I can't admit her for triage at this time. We have a full waiting room, and we're short-staffed this afternoon." County General is 6 blocks east on 3rd Avenue. They have a pediatric walk-in unit that can see her. He said she has a fever of 103.4. "I walked here. I don't have a car." She said, "Sir, I understand, but this facility is not equipped to handle uninsured walk-ins at this hour. County is the appropriate." He said, "Please. She has been sick for 2 days." Renata Forsythe looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at her screen. "We don't have time for walk-ins like this. Take her to County." The room was very quiet after she said it. The television murmured near the ceiling. The institutional hum continued. 22 adults in plastic chairs looked at their phones, their shoes, their hands. Not one person said stop, not one person, except Dorothy Watkins in the corner, in the yellow cardigan, and Priya Anand in the doorway, who stood still for 7 seconds and then moved. Marcus carried Grace to the seat by the window. He sat down. He gave her a cracker from the paper bag, and she held it without eating it. Her eyes were heavy. He put his hand on her forehead and kept it there. Dorothy Watkins was 71 years old. She had come in for a follow-up appointment and had been waiting 40 minutes and had given up on her crossword puzzle because she could not concentrate. She had grown up in Selma, Alabama. She had marched when she was 16. She had spent 50 years watching rooms decide how to treat people based on what they were wearing and who they appeared to be, and she had been too tired to say anything about it on some of those occasions and not tired enough on others. And this afternoon she was not tired enough. She got up from her chair. She walked across the waiting room. She sat down beside Marcus and Grace. She handed Grace a small pack of tissues from her purse, the soft kind, without saying anything. Grace took it. Dorothy looked at Marcus. She said, "How long has she had the fever?" He said, "Since Tuesday." She said, "That child needs to be seen right now." He said, "I know." She put her hand over his. One hand, steady and warm and certain. She said, "Don't you move. I'm going to get someone." She got up. She walked to the desk. She planted herself in front of Renata Forsythe, and she said, in a voice that had been forged over 7 decades into something that did not waver, "That little girl over there has had a fever for 2 days, and she has not been assessed, and I am not moving from this spot until some goes and looks at her." Renata Forsythe began to say something about protocol. Dorothy said, "I have been coming to this hospital for 30 years. Get me someone who can help that child, or get me someone who can explain to me why you won't." Priya Anand had already moved. Those 7 seconds in the doorway were, she would later write, the longest 7 seconds of her life. She had seen the whole exchange from the corridor. She had heard every word. She had felt the specific frozen quality that comes over a person when they understand that what is happening in front of them is wrong, and that they have the ability to do something about it, and that doing something will be uncomfortable, and not doing something will also be something they carry. She had stood in that particular fork in the road for 7 seconds. Then she had walked to her clinical supervisor. Claudette Warren was a registered nurse with 22 years of experience and the particular composure of someone who has seen enough. That very little surprises her, but enough that she never pretends it doesn't matter. Priya found her in the break room and said, in a voice she kept carefully level, "There is a man in the waiting room with a 7-year-old who has a fever of 103.4 and has had it for 2 days and was turned away at the desk. I need to know the correct protocol because I am going to follow it exactly." Claudette looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she set down her coffee and walked out. She came through the waiting room door and assessed the situation in approximately 15 seconds. She walked directly to Marcus and Grace. She crouched down to Grace's level. She said, "Hello, sweetheart. Can I feel your forehead?" Grace nodded. Claudette touched her forehead with the back of her hand and then put a pulse oximeter on her finger and a thermometer near her ear, 103.8. Claudette straightened up. She said to Marcus, "Come with me." She walked them back through the doors without stopping, without explanation, without looking at the desk. Grace Tillman was assessed within 7 minutes of Claudette Warren entering that waiting room. The attending physician, a young doctor named James Okafor, who had just finished his residency the year before, and who would later say that night was one he thought about when he wondered why he had chosen emergency medicine, found a severe bilateral ear infection that had spread to the upper respiratory tract, bacterial, progressing. Left untreated another 24 hours, it could have complicated significantly. He prescribed a course of antibiotics, ordered IV fluids for dehydration, and admitted Grace for overnight observation. Marcus sat beside his daughter's hospital bed. He did not make any phone calls. He did not tell anyone where he was. He held Grace's hand while the IV dripped and watched her temperature come down degree by degree over the next 4 hours. And at 4 in the morning, she finally slept without the restless heat-driven tossing that had been keeping her half awake, and he sat in the chair beside her in the dark and breathed. He waited until morning to do what he was going to do. At 7:14 the next morning, he opened his laptop and wrote an email to Gerald Ashworth, the CEO of Crestwood Community Hospital. Gerald had been on the board for 15 years. He had known Marcus since the donation. He had taken him to dinner once, a quiet dinner, where Mark had deflected every attempt to celebrate him, and spent most of the evening asking Gerald about the hospital's underserved patient access, numbers, and whether the triage protocol addressed language barriers for non-English speaking families. The email was 3 paragraphs. Marcus wrote without drafts. He described the time, the date, the words spoken, the temperature his daughter had presented with, the condition she was ultimately diagnosed with, and the fact that she had been admitted for overnight care. He described what Dorothy Watkins had done, and what Priya Anand had done, and what Claudette Warren had done, because he believed credit was a form of honesty, and he would not tell this story without it. The last paragraph said, "I am not writing this to seek personal remedy. I am writing it because a child was turned away from a building that bears her grandmother's name, and because I want to understand how that is possible and what we intend to do to ensure it never happens to anyone else's child. I believe this institution is better than what happened at that desk yesterday afternoon. I would like the institution to prove that." Gerald Ashworth read the email at 7:31. He sat at his desk for 9 minutes without moving. Then he called his chief medical officer, then his director of nursing, then legal counsel, in that order. Each conversation was the same. They had a serious situation that required immediate and full attention. Nobody minimized it. Nobody tried to manage it. Whatever instinct some administrators have to contain and explain and soften, that instinct in Gerald Ashworth had been worn away by enough years in healthcare to know that containing and explaining was how you made something small become something catastrophic. He called Marcus at 7:52. Marcus answered on the second ring. Gerald said, "Marcus, I've read your email. I am deeply sorry. Tell me what you need." Marcus said, "I need to know what your triage protocol says about pediatric patients presenting with elevated fever." Gerald said, "It says they are to be triaged and assessed immediately. That is the protocol." Marcus said, "Then I need to understand the gap between what the protocol says and what happened at that desk yesterday afternoon. And I'd like that conversation to include the people responsible for training and supervising front-of-desk staff, because the answer to this problem is not a single individual. The answer to this problem is a system." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you come in this week?" Marcus said, "I'll be in tomorrow morning for my regular shift." He hung up. He looked at his daughter sleeping. Her cheeks were cool. Her breathing was easy. The yellow pom-pom hat hung on the bedside table hook. He held his head up. The all-staff meeting happened 3 days later, in the Della Mae Tillman Pavilion conference room. 84 staff members. Gerald Ashworth did not begin with a policy review, or a procedure manual, or a legal caution. He began with a story, and he told it slowly, because the only way to close the gap between what an institution says it values and what it actually does is to make the gap visible and let people look at it without flinching. He told them about the man with the $4.7 million check who had asked for his mother's name on a wall, and nothing else. He told them about the 2 years of Thursday morning. Volunteer shifts in gray coveralls. He told them about a little girl in a yellow pom-pom hat with a fever of 103.4 who was told to go to county. He said, "Her name is Grace. Her grandmother's name is on the wall of this building. And yesterday afternoon, this building turned her away." He let the room hold that. "I want to be precise about something," he continued. "I am not standing here because of who her father is. I am standing here because of who she is. A child, a sick child, a child who had been sick for 2 days and whose father had walked 9 blocks to get her here because he trusted that this is what this place was for. And this place told him to keep walking." In the back row, Renata Forsyth sat very still. I have also asked that the 2 staff members who did the right thing be acknowledged. Claudette Warren, who I suspect is not surprised to be in this sentence, went into that waiting room and brought that child in from the cold within minutes. And Priya Anand, a 3rd-week clinical rotation student, was the first person to move, the first person in that room to decide that standing still was not an option. I want this institution to be very clear about what we think of that decision. Priyanand in the 3rd row felt something that had no clean name, something adjacent to purpose. She looked at Claudette beside her. Claudette gave the smallest of nods. "We are going to change," Gerald said, "not because we are required to, because we should have already, and because we cannot tell the next family that it was before the changes." Marcus came to the board meeting on day 4 in a dark jacket and gray slacks, not the coveralls. He had deliberated about this for longer than he would have admitted. The coveralls were honest, but this meeting required a different kind of honesty, the kind that made the room understand that the man asking for 7 specific changes was not asking from a position of powerlessness, and that the changes were not requests made by someone who could be managed or deferred. He sat down. He placed his 4-page document on the table. He did not begin with the donation. He began with Grace. He said her name first. He said the name of every child who he believed had been turned away from a desk before Grace, which was not a number he had yet, but which he intended to find out. He said the purpose of what he was about to propose was not punitive. It was corrective. He said the difference mattered. Then he walked through the 7 reforms. Mandatory implicit bias training for all patient-facing staff with annual renewal. Not optional, not self-directed. Structured, facilitator-led, with accountability measures. An overhaul of the triage intake protocol to remove language that allowed subjective, front desk discretion on who received initial assessment. The protocol would be explicit. Pediatric patients presenting with fever would be assessed. Period. A funded patient advocate position, independent of the nursing or administrative hierarchy, with the authority to intervene on behalf of any patient who felt they had been improperly handled. The position would report to the board, not to hospital management. An anonymous incident reporting system for patients and their families, not the staff reporting system that already existed, but one designed specifically for patients, accessible from any waiting room and from the hospital's public website. A quarterly equity audit of all intake data, disaggregated by race, insurance status, neighborhood of origin, and presenting condition, with results reported to the full board and made available on the hospital's public transparency page, a scholarship fund for nursing students from underrepresented communities, completing clinical rotations at the hospital. He would personally fund the first 3 years. After that, the hospital's operating budget would sustain it, and the renaming of the patient rights policy. He paused after the seventh item. He said, I would like to call it the Grace Standard. Nobody spoke for a moment. Gerald Ashworth said, we accept all 7. The vote was unanimous. It took 2 hours and 37 minutes, including a recess. Marcus was back in his car and driving home before the board had fully dispersed. The investigation into the front desk practices took 4 weeks. It was conducted by an outside firm at Marcus's request so that neither the hospital's legal exposure nor its administrative relationships could shape the findings. What the investigation found was worse than an isolated incident. In the 18 months preceding that Thursday afternoon, the informal internal reporting system had logged 4 complaints involving the same desk station during Renata Forsyth's shifts. 3 of the 4 complainants were black. 3 of the 4 had been assumed to be uninsured based on appearance. All 4 had been directed to county facilities. Not one of the 4 complaints had been escalated to a supervisor. Not one had been formally documented. They had been noted and filed in a folder, and the folder had been placed in a drawer. Marcus received a summary of the findings before they were presented to the board. He read it once. He folded it and set it down and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he called Gerald Ashworth and said, find those 4 families. The hospital retained legal counsel within the week. Settlement discussions were initiated. The process was private, but legal observers, familiar with the cases, estimated that the total exposure across the 4 cases fell somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. Every family was contacted directly, in person, by Gerald Ashworth himself. He apologized on behalf of the institution. He used specific language, not the vague institutional language of managed apology, but specific language that named what had happened and acknowledged its cost. Renata Forsyth resigned 3 days before her administrative hearing concluded. She did not contest the findings. She left the nursing field. Gerald Ashworth held a press conference on a Wednesday morning. 6 weeks after Marcus had sent that 3-paragraph email, he announced the Grace Standard reforms. He announced the equity audit. He named the scholarship fund. He thanked Claudette Warren and Priya Anand by name. He did not mention Marcus Tillman. He had been instructed not to. Samuel Cho found Marcus anyway. Samuel Cho was a reporter for the Birmingham News who had been covering healthcare equity for 3 years and who had sources inside the hospital, who trusted him because he was accurate and because he did not sensationalize, and because when he said he would protect a source, he meant it. He had been following this story through back channels since week 2. He had the shape of it before he had the name at the center of it, and when he finally got the name, he sat with it for a day before he made any calls, because he understood that the story had a way it wanted to be told, and he needed to figure out whether the man at the center of it wanted it told at all. He reached Marcus through Ron Devereaux. Ron passed a message. Marcus agreed to 20 minutes in person at the hospital. They met in the corridor of the Della Mae Tillman Pavilion on a Thursday morning. Marcus was in his coveralls. He had just finished a volunteer shift. He was pushing a supply cart. The bronze plaque with his mother's name was on the wall 8 feet behind him. Samuel Cho asked his questions carefully. He asked about the donation, and Marcus was answered briefly and factually. He asked about the volunteer shifts, and Marcus said the work mattered to him. And he left it at that. He asked about the night in the waiting room, and Marcus described it with the same precision with which he described everything, without heat, without performance. Then Samuel Cho said, "Why do you still come in?" "What? Still volunteer, still wear the coveralls." After all of this, Marcus stopped the cart. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet. The quiet of someone considering, not of someone uncertain. He looked at his mother's name on the plaque. He said, "She cleaned buildings her whole life. Not because she had to, though she did, but because she understood that the work was never the problem. The problem was always whether the people around you let the work make you invisible. She never let it. She came in every shift, and she held her head up, and she did the work. And she went home, and she made cornbread from a recipe card she had written out herself in a notebook she kept in her apron pocket. And she raised 5 children who knew that no amount of contempt from the outside world was going to determine what they were worth on the inside. He looked at Samuel Cho. "I come here because she taught me that true wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching." The check was easy, honestly. It was a number on a page. This, he gestured at the cart, the corridor, the supply room door down the hall. "This is the work, and the work is where she lives. And I'm not ready to stop coming here." The interview ran on Thursday. By Saturday morning, it had been read 430,000 times. By Monday, it had been picked up by 11 national outlets. By Tuesday, Marcus had 37 voicemails from strangers. He sat at his kitchen table and listened to every one of them. Some were brief. Some ran for 4 and 5 minutes. A woman in Ohio called to say her father had died in a county hospital waiting room 17 years ago, and she had never known what to do with that. A man in Memphis called to say he had worked as a janitor for 31 years, and he had his college degree in a frame above his workbench, and nobody at his job had ever asked to see it. And the story made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like that mattered. A nursing student in Nashville called and could not finish a sentence. Marcus listened to everyone. He did not return any of them. But he listened. There was one more thing that needed to happen, and it happened quietly, the way most of the things in this story happened quietly. Priya Anand wrote him a letter. Not an email, a letter. Handwritten on notebook paper, 3 pages, in the careful handwriting of someone who was not accustomed to writing by hand, and who had taken time with it anyway. She left it at the front desk, addressed to Marcus Tillman, and it sat in the mail sorting area for 2 days, before it found its way to Ron Devereaux's, who knew where to forward it. Marcus read it at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Grace ate oatmeal across from him and told him at length about a disagreement she had had with a classmate about whether horses or dogs were smarter, which was, Grace felt, not even a real question because the answer was obviously horses. He unfolded the letter and read it while Grace reasoned her case. Priya had written about the 7 seconds. She had written about what those 7 seconds felt like from the inside, the frozen quality of them, the knowledge of what was happening, the competing pressures of protocol and hierarchy, and the plain human fact of a child with a fever. She wrote that she had been afraid, not of anything specific, but of the general fear that comes with stepping into the gap when the institution has not explicitly told you to. She wrote that she had stepped in anyway, and that she would step in again, and that she understood now that the willingness to step in was something that could be trained in a seminar or mandated by a policy, though policies mattered. She wrote that it was a decision that got made before the moment, in all the moments before, in who you decided to be when you came into the work. She wrote in the last paragraph, "I don't know if I would have moved if I hadn't already decided, somewhere before I ever walked into that hospital, what kind of nurse I was going to be. I think that decision gets made long before the moment when it matters. I think I'm still making it every day, and I think that's what you have been trying to tell this place all along. That true wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. I watched, and I won't forget what I saw." Marcus read the letter twice. He folded it carefully, the way you fold something you plan to keep. He got up from the table and went to the drawer in the hallway where he kept things he wanted to keep. Grace's first drawing, his mother's cornbread recipe card in faded ink, a photograph of Camille laughing on a Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, laughing at something outside the frame, some ordinary, beautiful thing. And he put Priya's letter in that drawer. Grace looked up from her oatmeal and said, "What was that, Daddy?" He said, "A letter from someone brave." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "Then?" She said, "Braver than a firefighter?" He said, "Different brave." She went back to her oatmeal, satisfied. 1 year after that Thursday afternoon in the waiting room, the Grace Standard was in force across the full patient intake process at Crestwood Community Hospital. The first annual equity audit was released to the public. The numbers were not comfortable reading. In the 12 months prior to the reforms, patients presenting as uninsured were triaged to secondary facilities at a rate 3.4 times higher than insured patients presenting with identical symptom profiles. Black patients presenting as uninsured were triaged out at a rate 4.1 times higher. The numbers were in the report. They were available to anyone who wanted to look at them. The hospital published them anyway, because Marcus had asked that the audit be fully public, not summarized, not softened, and Gerald Ashworth had agreed. In the 12 months following the reforms, the disparity had dropped to near parity across all measured categories. Not zero, not perfect, near parity, which was a different world. The Grace Standard had been adopted in modified forms by 6 hospital systems in Alabama and Georgia. The National Nurses Association cited the case in a policy brief on equitable triage practices distributed to 12,000 member facilities. A law school in Atlanta had incorporated the full case study, the timeline, the reforms, the equity audit data, the scholarship model, into its health law and bioethics curriculum. The anonymous patient incident reporting system received 47 submissions in its first year. 31 led to policy reviews. 11 led to formal corrective action. None involved a child being told to go to county. Claudette Warren was promoted to Director of Nursing Education. Her first initiative was a mandatory training module she built herself, drawing from the case drawing from conversations with Priya and Dorothy Watkins and two of the four families whose prior complaints had never been escalated. She called the module the corridor decision. She named it for Priya's 7 seconds. She built it around a single central question that every nurse and every intake staff member and every administrator was asked to sit with at the end of the module. And the question was, what did you decide before the moment arrived? Priya Anand passed her licensure exam with the highest score in her cohort. She accepted the full-time position in the Pediatric Emergency Unit at Crestwood. She was assigned to the team whose intake area sat 40 feet from the desk where Renata Forsyth had looked at a man in gray coveralls and made a decision in 4 seconds. She did not avoid that desk. She walked past it every shift. She thought it was important to walk past it. Dorothy Watkins received a letter from the hospital board, signed by Gerald Ashworth, formally thanking her for her actions that afternoon. She framed it and hung it in her kitchen, above the table, because she believed in remembering. The first cohort of the Grace Standard Nursing Scholarship was announced at a ceremony in the Della Mae Tillman Pavilion. 3 recipients, $2,500 each, all clinical rotation students, all from communities underrepresented in healthcare. Priya Anand's name was the first one called. She had not expected to be included. The scholarship criteria did not specify current students. She sat in the audience and heard her name and felt the specific quality of being surprised by something you had already, without knowing it, been hoping for. She went to the podium. She looked at the room, the board members, the administrators, the nursing staff, Gerald Ashworth in the front row, and in the back, in a dark suit and a too colorful tie, Marcus Tillman, with Grace beside him in a green dress, coloring in a small notebook she had brought from home. Priya said, I was standing in a doorway 7 seconds before I decided to move. I would like everyone in this room to know that, because I think it's important to be honest about how long it can take to do the right thing, even when you can see it clearly. 7 seconds doesn't sound like very much. But in those 7 seconds, the whole rest of my career passed in front of me. Who I was going to be, what I was going to do when the moment arrived. I chose to move. I hope I always choose to move. And I know that true wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching, because I watched someone give everything back in a place where nobody knew who he was. And it changed what I knew was possible. Grace looked up from her coloring. She tugged her father's sleeve and whispered, Daddy, is that the nice lady? He said, That's her. She nodded seriously. She looked at the plaque on the wall, the way children look at things they find interesting, openly, without agenda. Then she went back to her drawing. Marcus looked at his mother's name, the dates, the quiet, permanent fact of her. He held his head up. He pushed his supply cart down the same corridor the next Thursday morning, and the one after that. The mop, the work, the being there, not for recognition, not for the bronze plaque or the board vote or the press coverage, for her, for the lesson she had given him for free, and that had cost her everything. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. He had believed it since he was 12 years old, reading a financial newspaper on a city bus, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner. He believed it now. The part that stays with me about this story is not the board meeting. It is not the press conference. or the settlement, or the 6 hospitals in 2 states that rewrote their intake protocols. The part that stays with me is a drawer. A hallway drawer in a quiet house in Birmingham where a man keeps a handwritten letter from a 24-year-old nursing student next to his first drawing, next to a recipe card in his mother's handwriting, next to a photograph of someone he loved who is gone. 4 things, 4 things he chose to keep. Not the check stub, not the bronze plaque, not the newspaper clippings. Those 4 things. That drawer tells you everything you need to know about what a person actually values when the room is empty and no one is grading them. Here is what I have been turning over since I first heard this story. Every single one of us moves through rooms where someone needs us to do something. Not a dramatic emergency. Not a waiting room at 4:47 in the afternoon with a sick child and a man in gray coveralls. Just an ordinary room. A comment that went unchallenged. A door that didn't get opened. A moment where the correct thing was visible and the comfortable thing was to be very busy with something else. 7 seconds of stillness that became 8, became 10, became nothing. Priya Anand stood in a doorway and she made a decision about who she was going to be. Not in that moment. She made it in all the moments before. She made it in why she came into the work. She made it in the grandmother she carried with her. She made it before the crisis. And when the crisis arrived, all that earlier deciding came forward and moved her feet. So here is my question for you. And I want you to be honest. Not with me, with yourself. 1 word in the comments. That is all. What are you? Not what you should be, not what you hope to be, not what you would be in the version of the story where you are the brave one. What are you? 1 word. If this story lived in you today, share it with 1 person. Someone who is standing in a doorway right now and doesn't quite know if they are going to move. That is who this story is for. Subscribe if you are not here yet. We are building a catalog of the quiet people who changed loud things, and I do not want you to miss what is coming. Next time, a retired school teacher spends 22 years watching a broken system fail the children she loved. Then one morning, she walks into a courtroom as the judge. You will not want to miss it. True wealth is what you give back when nobody's watching. I will see you there.